Hey everyone, how's it going? This is Waj from the MW Technology channel on YouTube, and in this video we're doing a direct comparison between the Nexus 7, this is the 2013 edition, versus the iPad mini with the Retina display. Now both these tablets have a lot of things in common, certainly in terms of overall physical screen size and other physical attributes, but inside is certainly a different story, and they come in a pretty big price difference when you take a look at the Nexus 7, which is definitely more economically priced compared to the iPad mini with the Retina display. Now it's important to mention that Apple has released two versions of the iPad mini currently available. You have this version, which is the iPad mini with the Retina display, and you have the iPad mini 2. There's a couple of different unique differences between these two, but the iPad mini with the Retina display essentially has the Retina display, which defines its name, and it has the Apple A7 chip compared to the A5 chip that's in the iPad mini 2. Now what we're going to take a look at is the real world performance differences between these two tablets, which obviously run a very different operating system, where you have pure Android on the Nexus 7 and iOS 7 running on the iPad mini Retina. Now specifically we're going to take a look at the technical specifications of each of the tablets and see which one in reality outperforms the other and see which one is right for you. Now the first thing that we're going to take a look at, as usual, is the overall physical dimensions and overall feel and design of both the tablets. In terms of the overall footprint, the iPad Retina measures about 200 millimeters in its height, 134.7 millimeters in its width. Now interestingly, when we take a look at the Nexus 7, you'll notice that it is 200 millimeters, exactly the same as the iPad mini, but it is only 114 millimeters, so it's not as wide as the iPad mini. Now in terms of thickness, the iPad is just slightly thinner, measuring about 7.5 millimeters versus the Nexus 7's 8.65 millimeters. Now in terms of weight, the iPad mini with the Retina display is just slightly lighter than the Nexus 7 2013 edition, measuring about 331 grams versus the Nexus 7 measuring about 341 grams. Now in terms of overall design, comfort, and construction, you'll notice that both tablets are very well built in their own right. Now obviously Apple is very famous for using very high quality components, including aluminum construction chassis and a whole bunch of really high quality glass. Now the Nexus 7 is certainly not cheaply built. It has really decent quality rubbers and plastics, but it's definitely not up there with the iPad as you would expect from an Apple product, and the price is also reflected in this regard as well. Now in terms of ergonomic and overall feel and day-to-day use of both these tablets, the iPad is certainly comfortable to hold in pretty much landscape or portrait mode, but it kind of feels kind of slippery because of that aluminum construction. It's definitely not as grippy as the rubberized texture that you'll find on the Nexus 7, which is very comfortable to hold for long periods of time. You can hold it great in landscape and portrait mode. Of course, it's designed to be used in any orientation, much like the iPad mini, but both tablets, if I had to use one for a long period of time, it's really personal preference. I do like the Nexus 7 better because I can grip that tablet a lot better without having any case, and it seems to be just a little bit more comfortable for my size of hands. And obviously the iPad mini is great too. You can probably use it as comfortably as the Nexus 7, but again, you have to really pick up both tablets in your hands and see how they feel and use it for a long time to make your choice. Now one of the common factors of these two products is that they're both small sized tablets. They have larger companion products that are 10-inch or 9 inches or whatever, and really it's the display size that governs its category. Now when we take a look at the displays, you'll notice that the Nexus 7 is a 7-inch screen versus the iPad mini is a 7.9-inch screen, but they're both really high resolution for their screens. Now in terms of resolution itself, you'll notice that the iPad mini with the Retina display certainly has the better display in terms of resolution and pixel density. It measures about 2048 by 1536, and of course it's the Retina display. Now the Nexus 7 has an amazing screen. It has a 1920 by 1200 display, which is very nice. Now when we take a look at the pixel per inch count, you'll notice some huge similarities between the Retina model of the iPad mini and the Nexus 7, which measures about 323 on the Nexus 7 and 326 on the iPad mini with the Retina display, so very similar. The overall experience that you get on viewing different videos and reading text is extremely similar between these two devices. Now in terms of color accuracy and overall vibrance of the actual displays, I do have to say that the iPad mini in person, to me and to my eyes, looks a little bit more accurate when reviewing different photos of different colors that I know what they look like in real life. I think the iPad mini definitely has a little bit more of a realistic calibration on the screen, but overall in terms of vibrancy, both of the screens are very bright, very vibrant. Everything in terms of most things look very similar. Now continuing forth, when we take a look at the major differences between these two devices in terms of specification, we definitely have to mention that there is quite a big difference in terms of the overall CPU performance when running different applications. Now on paper, when we take a look at these two devices in terms of CPU, we have a Snapdragon 800 quad-core CPU clocked at about 2.2 gigahertz on the Nexus 7, which certainly you would think would be faster than the dual-core A7 chip that's in the iPad mini Retina edition. Furthermore, the Nexus 7 has double the amount of RAM, having 2 gigs of RAM versus 1 gig of RAM on the iPad mini, but when we actually do real-life tests, you'll notice that there's pretty marginal differences between the hardware, and when we actually do benchmark, you'll notice actually a pretty significant difference between the two. So the first thing to illustrate my point is we're going to open up Geekbench and just run our benchmark, the standard Geekbench 3 benchmark, and see what our score is. Now this is quite a dramatic difference between these two tablets. Even though the Nexus 7 has a quad-core processor, the A7, the same chip that's in the iPhone 5S, which is a very powerful phone, is actually doing double the performance on Geekbench 3 compared to the latest 2013 edition of the Nexus 7. Now Geekbench 3 gives the iPad mini more than double the score on the single core score, getting about 1393 on the iPad Retina and about 586 on the Nexus 7. And when we take a look at the multi-threaded benchmark on Geekbench 3, the iPad again is completely destroying the Nexus 7, getting about 2514 versus 1888 on the Nexus 7. Now to test out the graphical capabilities of both these two tablets, we're going to open up 3D Mark, which is a great, very intensive application that's going to use our GPUs in both of these two devices to the max and really see which one is better in terms of getting better overall consistent frame rates and overall graphical and performance. Now here, when we start reviewing the results of the 3D Mark benchmark, you'll notice a huge, massive difference of what the iPad mini Retina edition can do compared to the Nexus 7. Now on the Ice Storm Extreme benchmark, the Nexus 7 2013 edition got about 7163 versus the iPad mini Retina edition got about 10,122. Huge, massive difference. And when we take a look at the graphic test 1 and 2 average frame rates, you'll notice a massive, massive difference. We're getting about 57.9 frames per second on the first graphic test, and comparatively the Nexus 7 only got 34.8 frames per second on that same test. Now I wouldn't be too discouraged about the score on the Nexus 7 because I have gamed with a lot of different Android games on the Nexus 7 and it is a fantastic gaming device. Sure, it definitely doesn't perform as well as the mini, but in many cases when you play a lot of these simple games that are really not that graphic intensive, it's a great experience and you're never going to be counting the frames per second, so it's not a big deal. But if you're definitely a hardcore gamer, the iPad mini is definitely king of the small tablets. Now even though internally and the overall CPU and GPU performance might be drastic between these two devices, the cameras on the other hand are fairly similar. They both have 720p front-facing cameras that record 30 frames per second, and when we take a look at the rear cameras, they can do 5 megapixel stills at full 1080p 30 frames per second. And when we take a look at the stills capabilities, you'll notice that they're pretty similar in terms of overall color rendition and overall clarity, as well as very similar in terms of the 1080p video. So not a big difference in terms of overall camera performance between these two tablets. Now in terms of wireless connectivity, they're both dual band frequency compatible, so they can work with 5 gigahertz, 2.5 gigahertz, and all the way up to N standards of Wi-Fi. Unfortunately, there's no AC on either of these tablets. The iPad mini, actually, the Retina model actually has a multi-input, multi-output standard of Wi-Fi, so it can do a little bit more stable Wi-Fi speeds and overall consistency. I personally haven't found a big difference between the two in terms of Wi-Fi stability and overall speeds. They both have Bluetooth 4.0, and the Nexus 7 7 actually has NFC capabilities, which the iPad unfortunately does not have, but in iOS 7 they do have AirDrop mode and a couple of different features where you can transfer data wirelessly between two Apple devices. Now in terms of battery life, again, the iPad just edges this one out again by having 10 hours of battery life versus 9 hours on the Nexus 7, but overall I think again battery life is very variable upon how you use the device, so you can get very similar battery performance overall. But if we are going to compare, the iPad certainly should have a little bit better battery life. Now in terms of pricing and overall models that you can select from, Apple makes the iPad mini with the Retina display available from 16, 32, 64, and 128 gigabyte models, and the 16 gig model starts at $399 and it goes up from there. The Nexus 7 actually comes in 16 and 32 gigabyte versions, and the 16 gigabyte version starts at $229. Now if any of you guys are interested in getting the LTE versions of both these two devices, they are available. Apple sells them for about $100 more than the standard Wi-Fi versions, and Google sells it for about $80 more than the standard 32 gigabyte version of the Nexus 7. Now when we talk about the overall software and operating system that's running these two tablets, that's a gigantic discussion, because you're really talking about iOS versus Android, and as we mentioned before in countless of our reviews and comparisons, that's a pretty big deciding factor in getting either of these devices. It's really up to you and what you've used in the past and what you kind of experienced that will sway you to go with one tablet over the other. But the great thing about both of these two tablets is they're gonna be running the latest version of whatever OS that they're relatively running on. So you're gonna get the new KitKat on the Nexus 7, which is the 2013 edition. And the great thing about the Nexus products, you always get the latest Android. That's one of the big things about the Nexus product versus many other Android devices from Samsung and a whole bunch of other people. And when we take a look at Apple, Apple of course controls every facet of their OS and their hardware, so you're getting a really harmonious experience. And a lot of people love the easy to use and the just basic nature of the new iOS 7. Obviously it has some little quirks, but in terms of ease of use, it's definitely up there when it comes to just picking up the tablet and you already know how to use it. That's their big marketing thing, and it's certainly true when you get to actually use and play around the iPad mini with the Retina display. But overall, the OS and the hardware and how that all works is definitely going to be up to what your standards are, what your needs are, what you do on any one of these tablets. So definitely go ahead and try them for yourself and see which one really fits your needs and your preferences. But other than that, guys, if you have any questions about anything I talked about in this video, please make sure to leave that on a comment down below. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you liked the video. That'd be awesome. And thank you so much for your support. And we've been having such great fun making all these videos, and really enjoying that you guys are supporting us and watching the videos. Definitely subscribe if you haven't already. Check out our Facebook page if you haven't as well. But thanks again, guys, and we'll see you later. Take care.